Hello and welcome to Autistic FM. My name is Haje, I use he, him pronouns, and I'm your host on this journey. You can subscribe to Autistic FM wherever you get your podcasts, and you can find the transcripts and additional information about each episode on autistic.fm. In this episode, I'm doing a critical review of Brian Beam's book, Autistic Thinking, Literary Creativity as the Cause of Autism and the Cure for Autism, the requisite knowledge to prevent autism from happening to you and your family. Oh dear. As you might imagine from the title alone, this one is a doozy. So whether you're here for the takedown or to explore what real acceptance looks like, this episode has something for you. Before we dive in, a quick content warning. This episode discusses themes that may be distressing, including eugenics, ableism, and harmful stereotypes about autism. There's no graphic detail, but some of these topics are inherently pretty heavy, so please take care of yourself and listen accordingly. Buckle up as we unpack why this book deserves to be filed under pseudoscience and left to gather dust. Let's roll tape. In this episode of Autistic FM, I'm going to be doing something a little bit different. The X algorithm recently pushed a book by Brian Beams in my face. On the cover, it boldly proclaims that it has the cure for autism. I only recently discovered and accepted that I'm autistic, and I'm working pretty hard to stop masking it as much as I can in a pursuit to find my true self. And I've got to say, the idea that autism is something that needs to be cured is obscene. So I decided to buy a copy and give it a read. Spoiler alert, this book is an absolute abomination with undertones of eugenics. It doesn't stand up academically, medically, or philosophically. And if you started listening to figure out whether you should buy and read the book, I'll save you 45 minutes by summarizing. No, avoid it. Your life will be better for it. Now before we start, I want to make clear that I'm not here to make fun of Beams. Like all of us, he is allowed to shed whatever labels don't serve him, and to build his own identity. However, he makes some extremely harmful claims here that I refuse to let stand unchallenged. He ignores a century of science and claims that autism essentially doesn't exist. He then insists that the century-old pamphlet that coined the word autism was engaging in literary creativity, and that we can cure autism basically by unnaming it. So underneath my irritation that this 64-page shoddily referenced word soup of a pamphlet is masquerading as an informative publication, I kind of feel for the guy. Towards the end of the book, Beams explains that he was labeled against his will as having Asperger's syndrome by an unnamed group. There are no further details about this incident, but my own personal experience with labels leads me to think that maybe he was bullied. For decades, my own desire to be normal trapped me in a way of being that wasn't true to myself. I can almost see how, in a pursuit of normalcy, you could devote yourself to insisting to other people that you belong, rather than learning how to belong yourself. Instead of reading Beam's Autistic Thinking, there are a wall of well-researched, well-written, well-received books that focus on acceptance rather than masking yourself into normalcy. John Elder Robinson's Look Me in the Eye, it made me cry so many times as I recognized his struggles. Devon Price's Unmasking Autism is a must-read about what masking is and how to safely unmask. And if you're more of a fiction kind of person, The Curious Incident of the Dog in the Nighttime by Mark Haddon is a beautiful glimpse into the mask of autism and how it works. Thinking in Pictures by Temple Grandin is another classic. I also need to mention Neurotribes by Steve Silberman. It's an incredibly hard read. I had to put it down and pick it back up several times because it explores the history of autism through an unvarnished lens. And there are some horrible, horrible things in our history. I actually suspect Neurotribes is the book Beams wish he could have written if he had the talent and persistence to actually be a writer of any acclaim at all. Anyway, I'll drop the links to all of these books in the show notes, of course. Back to the book. Beams does not choose himself here. He chooses the idea of normal at all costs, which, man, I get it. I don't consider myself normal. I never have been. But I also reject the underlying principle that normalcy is something to strive for, and we'll talk more about that later in this episode. My lived experience is that autism isn't something you can just opt out of. It isn't as simple as just clicking an unsubscribe button and calling it a day. And a lot of people in the autism community, myself included, actually feel tremendous relief from having a label that can help us make sense of how we are different. Scraping the label off doesn't change the fact that all the underlying neurodivergences still exist. Now, for the rest of this podcast episode, I'm going to pick apart the book, in part to show what a pseudo-intellectual pile of garbage it is, but also in part to examine my own desire to be normal. For this episode, I'll be using an AI voice to read out sections of the book.
Hi, I'm an AI voice that's going to stand in for Brian Beams in this episode of the podcast. I have no idea what he actually sounds like, so I hope you will accept the creative license. There will also be a couple of other AI voices in this episode when Beams is quoting other people. We'll tackle those voices when we get to them.
Before we get to that, however, let's take a look at the core premise of the book. Now, Beams attempts to challenge the widely accepted view of autism as a neurodevelopmental issue by arguing that autism is a conceptual construct born out of literary creativity rather than a genuine medical condition. Rather than understanding the word autism as a label to describe certain behaviors, he flips the causality, and he suggests that the term autism created and shaped those behaviors. He says that language, culture perceptions, and diagnostic labeling, rather than any intrinsic biological or neurological difference, is the cause for autism. He also contends that the act of diagnosing autism is more about the observer's perception of certain behaviors rather than any inherent condition in the individual. Now, there's some nuance here, of course, and there is some truth to this, just not for the reason that Beams claims in his book.
The cause of autism, termed by Eugen Bleuler in 1911, has not been elucidated to this day. A scientific and logical approach can be utilized to eliminate potential causes and consider ideas not thought of before. Therefore, it is proposed that literary creativity is in fact the causative agent of autism, and that a biological cause of autism will never be found.
Whoa. Okay, so Beams is coming right out of the gate with some pretty major stuff packed into a tight paragraph. Let's break it down. 1, that the causes of autism are a complete mystery. Now, we haven't been able to point out the exact genes responsible for autism, but there is a strong family line correlation. That in itself points to genetics or maybe epigenetics as a relevant variable. 2, he claims that literary creativity is the causative agent of autism. That's a whole bunch of big words, but I think what Beams is trying to claim here is that autism is literally caused by Bleuler coming up with the term autism 113 years ago. Later in the book, he reinforces that idea. Now, that is fantastically out there, and I grant you, new theories can sound a little bit zany, so I'll give that the benefit of the doubt just for now. Don't worry, I'll rip that to shreds later. But it's crucial to understand that you can't just drop that big of a divergence from current scientific thinking without comprehensively backing it up. Third, Beam says that a biological cause for autism will never be found. And that's just not how science works. That's like standing around in 1920 and saying, well, I guess bacterial infections will just kill people forever. Cut to 8 years later in 1928, and Alexander Fleming discovering penicillin. There's 2 points worth making here. Beams is making a scientific prediction about the future, which that's a really unscientific thing to be doing, especially if you have no substantial proof to the contrary. He's also leaning heavily on a text by Bleuler from 1911. Now, 1911 is a long time ago. That's when Freud came up with the first ideas of psychoanalysis. It's 60 years before lithium was approved as a drug for treating bipolar disorder in the US. And look, the understanding of the human mind is imperfect even today, but it has evolved tremendously since 1911. Relying heavily on a 130-year-old text is deeply intellectually dishonest. For Beams, autism's increasing prevalence can be attributed to the societal shift towards overdiagnosis and an expanded definition of the spectrum rather than an actual rise of cases. In his conclusion, he suggests that if the name autism hadn't been coined in 1911, autism wouldn't exist today. Now, language is kind of my thing. I love words, I love puns, I love wordplay, I love the rich depth of language. Beams is treating the word autism like it's a prison cell. I appreciate that that might be true for him, But for me, words aren't cages, they are keys. Words allow us humans to grasp at the abstract, to create shared frameworks for understanding ourselves and others. You can take the concept of color, for instance. Ancient languages didn't always have a word for blue, which is why Homer describes the ocean as the wine-dark sea. Was the sea not blue back then? Of course it was. But the lack of language shaped his perception, making blue less distinct. Naming things gives us tools to see them. It's not an act of limitation, but it's an act of expansion. So when Beam suggests that autism wouldn't exist without its name, what he's really saying that he would prefer not to see it or autistic people. This isn't even about skepticism. It's about erasure or straight up denial. That's kind of like saying if only we didn't have a word for sad, nobody in the world would ever have to be sad again. Well, that's bullshit. Language doesn't create autism. It helps us recognize and articulate the experience. It helps us move toward understanding rather than living in a fog of ignorance. That reminds me of Temple Grandin's story that underscores all of this beautifully. She writes that the rules of etiquette didn't help her connect. They helped her hide. They were tools for passing, not for being understood. And words can function in the same way. When wielded carelessly, they obscure and they flatten. Chosen thoughtfully, words can build bridges. Now, I don't actually believe that language is powerful enough to shape reality. We can't create new pathologies out of thin air by making up words for them. I mean, fuck, if that was the case, we wouldn't be here talking about autism. Why wouldn't we have created a world that is powerful and beautiful and collaborative and love-forward and interesting? Beam's refusal feels less like a principled skepticism and more like an insistence on willful blindness. And what is so threatening about seeing? Beams further suggests that autism diagnoses are heavily influenced by observer bias and societal trends. He contends that the act of diagnosing autism is more about the observer's perceptions of certain behaviors rather than the inherent condition in the individual. Beam's main argument is that autism is essentially a literary fiction, like a term invented in a sci-fi novel, and that autism itself literally doesn't exist. On the cover of the book, Beam suggests that literary thinking is the cause of autism and the cure for it. But then he goes on to spend barely 1% of the contents of the book on the cure. Look, my take is that a book title is a promise, and Beams is breaking his promise to the reader spectacularly. I'm feeling betrayed. Imagine my surprise that the only place that Beams actually addresses his cure is chapter 13, which is just half a page of text. It's 400 words. And it culminates in saying that folks diagnosed with autism can be 100% cured. If they just... Actually, let me just let Beams tell you himself. Here's from page 55.
In short, the cure for autism is for individuals to simply change their self-concept of themselves. These actions, that individuals can change their self-concept of themselves, do not violate any scientific principle, concept, fact, or idea, especially since there is not any mechanism of pathology associated with autism. After all, without a mechanism of pathology, there is not anything physiologically binding an individual to that concept, thus freeing an individual with the ability to change the perception of themselves to that of a normal individual. Therefore, a previous diagnosis of autism can be completely reversed.
Oh, deep breath. Look, his conclusion and his cure aren't just misguided. They're an absolute travesty of thought and an insult to anybody who's ever cared about understanding autism, or anybody who understands how science or science writing works for that matter. So Beam's dismissal of decades worth of scientific research in favor of his own hand-wavy perception-based pseudo-theory is not only arrogant, but it's dangerous. Claiming that autism has no physiological pathology when mountains of evidence point to genetic, neurological, and developmental underpinnings, is the intellectual equivalent of sticking your fingers in your ears and saying, I don't believe in reality. It's not just ignorance, it's willful ignorance, and it's infuriating. The cure is particularly inane. Like his cure is saying, just change your self-concept. And that was actually kind of the moment where I was wondering if this whole book was just an act of masterful trolling. Sadly, the rest of the manuscript is woefully bereft of any charm or humor, so I don't think it's trolling. I think he's being genuine. Suggesting that autism can be erased with a mental pep talk and a diet tweak is not only laughable, but it's profoundly disrespectful to autistic people. It reduces the lived experience of autistic individuals to some sort of self-inflicted illusion, as if autism was nothing more than a bad habit you could just kick with a little bit of positive thinking. This idea isn't just wrong on so many levels, it's cruel. It gaslights autistic individuals, it undermines the legitimacy of their struggles, and it perpetuates the damaging stereotype that they're just not trying hard enough to be normal. Look, you don't even have to look further than past episodes of this podcast. We've had a dozen or so people struggling to find their identities, their truths, and their humanness. This book is telling those dozen people and the millions of people like them that they're doing it wrong. That they should just mask harder, that they should just try to be more normal. That's just denialism masquerading as insight. It invalidates millions of autistic people, dismisses their experiences, and spits in the face of anybody who's ever worked to advance our understanding of autism. The author's reckless disregard for the truth is an insult to science, humanity, and basic decency. It should be called out for the toxic nonsense that it is. And still, buried underneath the layers of arrogance and ignorance, there is something undeniably human. I can see the longing to fit in, the desire to be accepted, to be loved, and to be truly seen. And that desire is universal. It's particularly poignant for many autistic individuals who faced rejection and misunderstanding. And the tragedy of this book is that Beam suggests that the path to belonging is through changing yourself. In other words, through masking, through denying your identity, through forcing yourself to conform to some arbitrary notion of normal. That's not love. That's erasure. The real solution isn't bending yourself out of shape to fit into spaces that don't value you. The solution is finding the people who will celebrate you for who you are, quirks and all. And that's a message this book misses entirely in its desperate scramble to redefine autism as something it isn't.
This book is intended to provide you with enough confidence to decide for yourself whether you want autism to play a role in your life or not. In my view, it will empower you with knowledge and give you a calm and peaceful feeling of knowing that you are indeed normal.
Yes. Some autistic people are able to get extremely good at masking, to the point that a psychiatrist or indeed any other human being may believe that they are quote-unquote normal. But that level of masking comes at an incredible emotional and energy expenditure cost. What Beams is suggesting is that autistic people should just take responsibility for how they are perceived out in the world by just masking a little bit harder. I mean, I will grant you that is one approach. The problem is, it's an approach that comes with a whole bunch of challenges and side effects. And many autistic folks are really fucking tired of trying to pretend to be normal to placate everybody else out there all the time. And for those of us who are trying to lean into self-acceptance and want to be seen for who we are and not for the mask we wear to make other people feel comfortable, these two first pages of this book land like a damaging echo from the past. It's an ableist vision of the world that we're actively trying to put behind us. Now, if this book had been written in the 1990s, I could have simply written it off as a relic from a bygone era. Unfortunately, the publish date on this thing is September of 2024. And it just feels like an anachronism. We've moved on from here. We are better than this.
I am proud of the fact that this work ended up being in book format. The main reason for this is because I want this work to go directly to the public to touch other lives for good.
Look, I'm so happy for you. I get it, man. I've written a whole ton of books. It's incredibly satisfying. But I hate to break your bubble. This book is going to fall far short of your stated goals.
After reading the sources, references, and the writings written before me, it is up to you to judge for yourself whether the conclusions I have come to are correct or not.
Thank you. That's a good reminder. I've been fucking fuming as I've been reading and rereading this book 3 times over the past few days. I appreciate Beams' invitation to let me judge for myself whether the conclusions he reaches are correct or not, hence this podcast episode. Although if you're listening to this, I suspect you've already got a pretty clear image of where my judgment falls. Okay, let's get into some of the critical flaws in this book's thinking. A core part of this book's arguments rests on what appears to be a misunderstanding. Now, Beams is a medical technician, which means he spends his days staring at vials of blood and tissue samples. In that context, pathology has a very specific meaning. Something is wrong with the sample. There's something in there that's not meant to be there, or there's something missing that's meant to be there, basically. The problem is that pathology has a different meaning in psychology, and it seems like the author is either unaware of this or is willfully ignoring it. In psychology, pathology isn't a blood sample. It's a set of observed or reported behaviors. Psychology, by and large, just doesn't have the luxury of clearly established links between molecular measurements and complex behaviors. We can identify when the presence or absence of a molecule is correlated with a certain behavior, but determining causation and developing therapies often takes much, much longer. And this misunderstanding actually permeates the entire book. It's particularly obvious in chapter 5, where he argues that there's no pathology to autism. As I mentioned, Beams is a medical technician. In his own words, this is what that means.
As I was writing the book, I found that the training I obtained in the medical technology industry at Brigham Young University to be very useful. For those that do not know what a degree in medical technology is, it is basically a mini medical degree on the undergraduate level which prepares you to work in the laboratory of hospitals.
What Beams gets wrong here is that a medical technology degree is nothing like a medical degree. Sure, it does cover a lot of important medical topics like clinical lab testing and microbiology and chemistry and lab equipment, and these are skills that are essential for performing diagnostic tests and supporting medical teams. But that's where the overlap ends. An actual medical degree involves a vastly broader and deeper understanding of human health and disease, going far beyond the technical skills of analyzing blood samples or running tests in the lab. The way I read this is that Beams's degree is kind of like him being a plumber, but in this book, he's selling himself as a general contractor. He may very well be better at plumbing than anybody else on the building site, but I wouldn't trust him with the structural integrity of my apartment building. Medical students spend years learning anatomy, physiology, pathology, pharmacology, clinical medicine in an integrated and exhaustive way. They train to understand the complexities of the human body. They diagnose conditions and they create comprehensive treatment plans. They learn about patient care and ethics and communication skills and how to perform clinical procedures. And on top of this, they're required to complete rotations in specialties such as, surgery, pediatrics, psychiatry, internal medicine. And that gives them all hands-on experience in diagnosing and treating real patients. Doctors do rely on lab techs for part of what they do, but they need to synthesize lab data with clinical observations and imaging and patient histories and pharmacological considerations. And that's a skill set that MT training simply doesn't provide. Claiming that an MT degree is a mini medical degree grossly oversimplifies the depth and scope of medical education, and it misrepresents the role of medical technologist as being interchangeable with physicians. Look, I'm not saying they're not both vital. They are, but they're not remotely the same. And it does go some way towards explaining the misunderstanding. A pathology in the context of Beam's degree is something you can measure. Maybe it's blood or tissue or stool samples, that kind of thing. He actually explains it really well himself.
I usually say that phlebotomists and nurses draw the blood, that blood is given to me, and then I test the blood and give the results to the doctors. Going back to autism, this background was useful because there were some items which I wrote that came from that background in mind. For example, leukemias are a pathology which generally presents itself on its own. Therefore, when I encouraged others to let pathology present itself on its own, this was based upon experiences as a medical technologist. I guess I write this paragraph because I find the fact interesting that the subject of autism was never brought up in any of my medical technology classes because it belonged in the category of the social sciences and not the medical sciences.
The thing is, this excerpt actually illustrates the exact opposite of what Beams seems to think it does. It's a great example of how a limited understanding of medical science can lead to wildly reductive statements. I recently lost one of my closest friends to leukemia, and so I've done a lot of reading about it recently. And it turns out leukemia doesn't actually just present itself on its own, as if it's just sitting there waving a little flag saying, hey, I'm leukemia. That's not how the diagnoses actually work. And it highlights a key distinction between the role of a medical technologist and the work of a physician. A medical technologist's job is to perform tests like measuring white blood cell counts. Interpreting these results and putting them in context with symptoms and patient history and other diagnostic tools, that is where physicians come in. And it's this gathering and analysis of information that leads to a hypothesis, which is then tested further to arrive at a diagnosis. Seeing an abnormal white blood cell count doesn't give you the whole picture. Look, I'm not a physician, but a quick Google search did tell me that a low white blood cell count could be any number of things: aplastic anemia, lupus, rheumatoid arthritis, HIV, sepsis, some viral infections. Some antibiotics do this. Could be a shortage of vitamins or nutrition. There are literally dozens of potential causes, and the specifics to diagnose require careful and nuanced investigation involving more than just the lab results. And this highlights the fundamental difference between technicians and medical doctors. Technicians are experts in running tests and gathering data, but the doctors interpret that data in a clinical context, and then they integrate that with countless of other variables. To claim that leukemia presents itself without acknowledging that complexity is not only misleading, but it shows a lack of appreciation for the layered process of medical diagnosis. And drawing a parallel to autism based on this misunderstanding is like comparing apples to oranges and calling them the same fruit because they both grow on trees. Anyway, in psychology, a pathology refers to an abnormal pattern of thought, behavior, or emotion that may indicate a mental health disorder. Later in the book, Beams then goes on to further confuse himself because he gets sidetracked into research into whether there's a genetic test for autism and whether brain tissue biopsies can indicate autism. So far there isn't, but that's on the biology side of the fence, not on the psychology side. The author continues to belabor this misunderstanding throughout the book. He's showing in various ways that autism cannot be measured objectively. And here are two quotes illustrating this misunderstanding. The first one is from page 19.
Perhaps the strongest argument that autism will not be found with any pathology is that it originally did not start out with any pathology. If it did not start out with any pathology, then it is very logical to conclude that there is not any pathology today.
Once again, Beams's core premise is incorrect. Autism did in fact start out as a pathology. Children that now fall on the autism spectrum were instead being diagnosed with childhood schizophrenia and psychosis before the word autism came into use. Both illnesses did have diagnostic criteria, what you would call psychological pathologies today.
The fact that no scientific process was described by Eugen Bleuler through the production of scientific data gives strong credibility to the fact that it came about due to a very unscientific literary creativity process. This explains why a scientific cause is not known to this day, and why a scientific biological cause will not be found in the future. The lack of scientific findings is scientifically consistent with the explanation that it came due to a literary creativity process.
There's so many things wrong here. There was no scientific process described. That is correct. You can't measure somebody's skull and conclude that they are autistic. If you look at the entire DSM-5, very few of the described disorders can actually be measured with lab tests. Most are based on clinical observations or patient-reported symptoms. By Beams's definitions, the vast majority of mental illness isn't measurable in the lab, and therefore they are all fictions of our imagination. Look, many things in this world are demonstratively real, as in they definitely exist, without us having a distinct explanation for how they work or what causes them. The placebo effect, consciousness, even yawning. I mean, yawning exists. You can see yawning, but we haven't quite figured out how or why these things work. That's not a controversial thing in science. Like, not being able to explain what causes autism doesn't make autism magically disappear. Just like if I can't explain to you how yawning works, suddenly you stop yawning. That's not how that works. Beams also claims that a biological cause will not be found in the future. It must be nice to have a crystal ball, but science has a way of surprising us. Put simply, we may never figure out what directly causes autism, but saying that we will definitely never figure it out is absurd. That's not how science works. Saying that we don't have scientific findings and that therefore Beams's theory must be correct, because earlier in the book he concluded there could only be two possible options, is just baffling. Throughout the book, Beams repeats this point again and again. On page 9, for example, he tries to argue that the act of naming something brings it into existence.
It is important to consider that the creation of new terms, such as autism, is a creative process in and of itself, especially when the mechanism of pathology is not defined by the original authors.
Look, it is true that naming something is a creative process, but that doesn't mean that naming something brings it into existence. Names are more like the exercise in focus. They help us focus on an aspect of the thing we are curious about. Medicalization, or describing something as outside the range of a normal human activity, is a problem. Psychiatry in particular has a really nasty history of pathologizing the vast range of human experience when it falls outside of the preferred understanding of what it's like to be human. Women diagnosed with hysteria were prescribed a good marriage. Homosexuality was only removed from the DSM-1 after the Stonewall riots. It took years of undercover activism by gay psychiatrists to make that change possible. The term drapetomania was coined by a physician who believed that chattel slavery improved the life of enslaved Africans, because he could not imagine any reason for a slave to escape other than mental illness. The bigotry on display here was obvious enough, even at the time, that his peers made fun of him immediately. Look, I could do a whole podcast series on the evolution of the DSM. Maybe I will. But the important thing to highlight is that the pathologizing comes from the perceived deviation from whatever normal is. And we get to create normal. Today, an unmarried woman is unremarkable. Gay people are out of the closet. We reject slavery. The humans that experienced life this way demanded that they were included as part of the normal human experience, and they now are. The same thing is happening with autism, neurodivergence, and a bunch of other things that were once perceived as not normal. The process of understanding ourselves is happening. It's happening today. People still have gender dysphoria. They still have intellectual disabilities or anxiety, but we just don't call it transsexualism or imbecility or hysteria anymore. The names evolve with us. I just want to remind you, there are things in the world that are real without having explanations for how they work or what causes them. Not being able to explain what causes autism doesn't make autism magically disappear. Now that we've cleared up what names are and how they work, let's move on to the other big fallacy in this book, which is that there is an irrefutable record of history. Beams is clinging on to history for dear life. Several of his source materials are between 130 and 70 years old. But he doesn't seem to have a basic grasp of historical context. The world was very different a century ago. Psychology was a field that essentially didn't exist. And if Beams is going to use century-old source materials, he absolutely needs to approach them with some historical context and some openness to the fact that things change. And our understanding of the things changes too. Neither is present in this book, and it makes it such a frustrating read. One example of this is a quote he throws in there from a 1949 book.
My search for autistic children of unsophisticated parents has remained unsuccessful to date, writes Kanner in 1949. Additionally, genetic diseases discriminate based upon genetics and not upon sophistication.
Here, Beams quotes Steve Silberman's Neurotribes. Now, Neurotribes is a far better historical summary of neurodivergence than Beams' book can ever hope to be. But crucially, in the book that Beams quotes, Silberman provides the necessary context for today's reader to understand the quote. Back in the 1940s, access to mental health was essentially non-existent, and the only people who sought out psychiatry were extremely wealthy. Put simply, it's really hard to imagine how Kanner would even go about finding autistic kids born to unsophisticated parents. In Chapter 2, Beams explains that Bleuler first introduced the term autism in his 1911 book Dementia Praecox, or The Groups of Schizophrenias. It was translated to English in 1950. Among other things, Bleuler coined the words autism, schizoid, and schizophrenia. Incidentally, Bleuler also advocated for some pretty grim things. This isn't mentioned in Beam's book, but allow me another quick detour with another AI voice. A quote from Bleuler's Textbook of Psychiatry. He writes,
"The more severely burdened should not propagate themselves. If we do nothing but make mental and physical cripples capable of propagating themselves, and the healthy stocks have to limit the number of their children because so much has to be done for the maintenance of others, if natural selection is generally suppressed, then unless we will get new measures, our race must rapidly deteriorate."
So basically, he's arguing for eugenic sterilization, which is abhorrent on a number of levels. That doesn't invalidate everything Bleuler has ever said or written, but it should inspire some healthy skepticism and a reminder that 130 years ago things were very, very different indeed. On page 6, Beamer continues.
The cause of autism currently remains elusive. This may be because the idea of the cause of autism is due to literary creativity has not been considered.
Now let's ignore the crimes to grammar in that passage and instead focus on the wild leap of logic that Beams makes here. While it's true that there's no specific cause for autism currently known, using that as a logical argument for literary creativity makes no sense at all, because you could make the same argument for anything. The cause for autism remains elusive. That might be because nobody has considered the impact of hamster fur on children. Like, logically, that makes the same amount of sense, and practically, it's the same level of absurd. In chapter 4, Beams continues his bizarre detours through 100-year-old texts. In this case, he quotes Woodward's 1924 Study of Mental Life. Now, the quote is zany and it's comprehensively debunked, and it illustrates why relying on century-old source material when you're trying to bring something new to the table may not be the best strategy. Still, let's humor him and let's hear Woodworth talk about how daydreaming is the same as autism.
Daydreaming by itself is an example of what is called autistic thinking, which means thinking that is sufficient unto itself and not subjected to any criticism. Autistic thinking gratifies some desire, and that is enough for it. It does not submit to criticism from other persons, nor from other tendencies of the individual, nor does it seek to square itself with the real world.
Woodworth, 1924, page 508.
Now, comparing autistic thinking to daydreaming is a truly ridiculous oversimplification that completely misses the mark on both concepts. Daydreaming is a universal experience. It's a mental drift where anyone, neurotypical or neurodivergent, might escape into imagination or in problem solving. It's temporary, it's fleeting, it's often voluntary. You can choose to sit and daydream. I daydream, and when I do, I can snap out of it. But I also fall into deep holes of semi-obsessive thoughts or hyper-focus on certain subjects, in this case, this book. When I get into that mode, somebody won't easily be able to get my attention. And on a very basic level, the two things are different. Making that comparison doesn't just show a lack of understanding. It's dismissive and it's harmful, and it's clinging on to an outdated concept. Even the much reviled inventor of ABA, Ole Ivar Løvaas, described it as distinct back in 1971. At the time, he called it stimulus over-selectivity. These days, we mostly call it hyperfocus. And in any case, the autism community has come to accept that hyperfocus can be a fun and productive state of being. In other words, Beams is quoting a 100-year-old source text that had been proven wrong many times over. And in doing so, he erases both the challenges and the strengths of autistic individuals. It also perpetuates damaging stereotypes, in that autistic people are lost in their own heads or disconnected from reality. This kind of rhetoric isn't just wrong, it's lazy, it's reductive, and it does a massive disservice both to people who are autistic and people who are trying to figure out how autism works. Beams doubles down, though, and argues that because it's just like daydreaming, you should just be able to snap out of it.
An observation that is important to consider from the writings of Woodworth is that there is not any pathology to autistic thinking as he defined it. An individual can, whether extreme or not, snap back into reality.
So this just reinforces the if only they tried harder they wouldn't be autistic narrative that Beams is spinning throughout this book. But he continues even further with this little gem on page 16, where he's arguing that if the understanding of autistic thinking hadn't evolved, we wouldn't have autism today.
These writings concerning autistic thinking are significant because had this understanding of autistic thinking remained the same throughout time, the epidemic of autism as it is understood today simply would not have happened.
There is so much to unpack here. So Beams is describing autism as an epidemic, which you can easily rip to shreds yourself by just Googling autism epidemic. But he then says that if only psychiatry hadn't evolved in the past 100 years, people wouldn't have been diagnosed as much today. I think that's what he's saying. Honestly, this is where I lost it. Like, the level of mental gymnastics you have to do to make this work logically is mind-bending. But Beams makes very little effort to take the readers along for the ride. So there's a couple of steps to this, but fundamentally, autistic thinking and autism are two separate but related things. Equating one aspect of autism with daydreaming and then drawing a conclusion that all of autism is like that just makes no sense. And then wishing that the understanding hadn't evolved over the past century is just bizarre beyond words. That's not how science works. But then it gets worse. In chapter 7, Beams argues that the bubonic plague and malaria existed even before people understood how it worked, but that autism popped into existence as soon as it was named.
To begin with, there were not any symptoms experienced by mankind prior to 1900. It was then suggested that it existed. Individuals then sought to apply autism to their lives, or more importantly, to the lives of others through diagnosis, all the while struggling to find the cause with no cause to be found.
So here, Beams has graduated from talking about pathologies to talking about symptoms, which is an obvious mistake. Of course autistic children had symptoms. That's how they ended up in the psychiatrist's office in the first place. The author then kicks it up a notch by taking us on a wild ride of a thought experiment.
It would be prudent to explore the idea of a thought experiment. This experiment consists of asking the question that if autism were to never be suggested in the first place, would mankind spontaneously and indiscriminately experience the symptoms of autism? In other words, would those who consider themselves to be normal spontaneously come down with the symptoms of autism as it is understood today?
I mean, this one's even easier to correct. In this thought experiment world, how would you make sense of late diagnosed autistic people? So, I mean, yes, the symptoms were there long before there was a diagnosis to help explain what was going on with them. But that's not all. This thought experiment is just fundamentally flawed, and it reflects a gross misunderstanding of autism as a neurodevelopmental condition. Autism is not a socially constructed concept that arises because somebody suggested it. Autism often manifests in early development and is then characterized by measurable differences in behavior. The experiment's premise, that autism could arise purely from societal suggestion, is a logical fallacy. It conflates neurological conditions with socially constructed phenomenon. This oversimplification disregards the objective reality of autism as a scientifically validated condition, and it trivializes the challenges faced by autistic individuals and perpetuates the ignorance. Anyway, let's turn to page 30 and listen to this gem.
In other words, if autism was not a problem before 1900, then it should not be a problem now.
I hear you, but as we've shown, it was a problem before 1900. So Beams's point is moot, and it invalidates his entire argument. The other thing that I find incredibly frustrating is that Beams is clearly trying to make a scientific point. And to do that, you have to talk about your source materials. But the thing is, the book is incredibly shoddily referenced. Throughout the book, he's relying most heavily on 3 source materials: Bleuler's from 1911, one by Leo Kanner from 1949, and one from Hans Asperger from 1991. Now, that last one is particularly puzzling because Asperger died 11 years earlier and didn't publish anything in 1991. I presume that Beams actually means another book by Jutta Frith, which may very well quote Asperger, but that's not how you reference stuff. Let me just say this. If a university professor had read this manuscript, they'd given some pretty serious demerits for citations. And on the topic of sources, by the way, the book is plagued with dubious citations and dodgy sources all the way throughout. In one section of the book, it's clear that the author used Google Translate to translate some 1911 source materials from French. And that makes very little sense to me on a number of levels. Out of the 3 sources quoted by Beams, 2 of them are in English and 1 is in German. I'm not sure where the French source material came from, which is a problem. Now I don't know where this information came from. But much more importantly, this is a wild thing to see in academic text. Listen to this.
Utilizing the translation services from French to English provided by Google Inc. and Loic Antheon.
Look, for God's sake, just hire a professional translator. Google Translate is great in a pinch, but it is notoriously unreliable for historic documents. Turns out that language changes over the course of a century, and so does cultural context. Throughout, he also refers to some sources that no serious academic would use as source material for, well, anything. Here's a good example.
In 1944, an Austrian pediatrician by the name of Hans Asperger described a condition very similar to that of autism, which was later termed as Asperger's syndrome. Citation: Autism Independent UK 2017.
I have no reason to doubt that what he's saying here is accurate. But why use Autism Independent UK as a source? So I checked out the sources in the back of the book, then Googled it and checked out the page. And it turns out that this is just a bio page for Hans Asperger on a UK website that trains people who are trying to help autistic folks. And taking a closer look at the site, let's just say there's some pretty problematic language there. That's outside of the scope for this podcast. What I do want to say, though, is that using a biography site for info about Asperger is fantastically lazy academically. In the biography, Beams cites a number of sources that could have been far more reliable, and that isn't a small thing. This author is trying to upend our entire understanding of autism. The very least you can do is to get your information from reliable, peer-reviewed sources, and not some site that's trying to sell courses that offer teach, or treatment and education of autistic and communication handicapped children. Look, any academic that made it this far, to page 4 in the book, would at this point discard this entire thing for what it is. Unscientific, unacademic ramblings that wouldn't receive a passing grade in an undergrad thesis. The book also has a bunch of weird logical fallacies beyond the ones we already talked about. Because Beams can only think of 2 possible explanations for autism, he argues that one of those must be the right one.
There might be other causes of autism which may exist but which have not been described. However, they will not be considered simply because they have not been suggested by this author or any other author for that matter. This simply leaves 2 alternatives suggested above, which include that it is of biological origin or that it came about due to literary creativity.
This is a hell of a head-scratcher. He creates a false dichotomy by reducing the possible causes for autism to only 2 options: a biological origin, which he then tries to disprove later in the book, or literary creativity, which is his idea. This framing just ignores the vast complexity of autism and the possibility of other explanations, such as, environmental or genetic environmental interactions or neurodevelopmental factors. These have all been widely studied and haven't been disproven yet. So to dismiss the alternative theories simply because they have not been suggested by this or any other author, it contradicts the very spirit of scientific inquiry, which requires openness to exploring all plausible explanation. And by the way, that's the same openness that Beams asks his reader to have for this book. He then continues to make another absurd argument, seeming to suggest that because the 2 options are mutually exclusive, if one is true, the other must be false, which, when a theory is proven, the other theories are going to have a hard time, right? But then he does this weird thing in chapter 8. He's trying to explain that because our understanding of autism has evolved over the last 130 years, it must be a made-up thing all along. Over the years, the diagnostic criteria evolved for a number of reasons. Instead of seeing this as a refining and evolving of our understanding of autism, and in particular the evolution from autism as a single monolithic and clearly defined set of symptoms, to the more modern spectrum interpretation of autism, Beams kind of perceived this as a problem. Here's an example from page 35.
This evolution is significant because it makes it nearly impossible to elucidate the cause of a condition such as autism, if the definition and meaning of it has changed so much over time.
Right. He then further concludes this.
Therefore, to elucidate the cause, one needs to go back to the upstream, or the original meaning of the term, and to learn how it was originally created.
So Beams is harking back to a simpler time, when things were easier to understand and more simply defined. Now, I do agree, actually, that it would be helpful if there was a clear diagnostic tool that could be attached to my fingertip and tell me whether or not I was autistic. Unfortunately, that's not quite the way that this one works. So, how do we wrap this up? Look, Brian Beams's autistic thinking is not just a failure of intellectual rigor. It's an affront to the autism community and anyone who values science. From his absurd central premise that autism is a byproduct of literary creativity, to its laughably reductive cure of simply changing your self-concept, this book is a masterclass in pseudoscience posturing. Beams's reliance on century-old sources, misinterpretations of basic psychological terms like pathology, and a flagrant dismissal of decades of research, it just reveals a level of ignorance. Like, it would be almost comical if it wasn't so harmful. And this isn't just a poorly researched pamphlet. It's a dangerous piece of work masquerading as insight. It's perpetuating harmful myths about autism, and it's actually preying on the weak. Like, people who are scared and worried about being autistic might read this and might think that this is in any way applicable to them. This is nuts. And the thing is, what makes this book truly insufferable is its arrogance. Beams doesn't just misunderstand autism, he completely refuses to engage with the lived experience of autistic people, or the vast body of research by researchers who've spent their career studying the condition. Instead, he doubles down on nonsensical theories and presenting them with an air of undeserved confidence. His insistence that autism wouldn't exist without its label is both historically ignorant and offensively dismissive of the challenges faced by autistic individuals long before it was formally recognized. And the book isn't just wrong, it's dangerously wrong. It deserves nothing less to be relegated to the dustbin of pseudo-academic drivel. If you're looking for a meaningful and informed exploration of autism, autistic thinking it's just the wrong place to start. It's also the wrong place to end. Don't even glance at it sideways. Like, there's so much good writing out there. This is just a dishonest waste of everybody's time. Thank you for listening. Thank you so much for listening to this week's episode of the podcast. You can find us on TikTok on Autistic FM, on Instagram at autistic_FM, and on the web on Autistic FM. On our website, you can also find a link to our newsletter, which I send out whenever we do a new episode, with some additional resources and news from across the world of neurospiciness. This podcast is produced and hosted by me, Haje Kamps. If you know somebody who would be a great guest on the podcast, please don't hesitate to get in touch. You can email us on hello@autistic.fm, or you can reach out via the socials. See you next week.